April 15th, 2024. Lommel, Belgium. The morning fog hasn't lifted yet. It clings to the ground like a memory that won't let go. A school bus pulls up to a wrought iron gate on the edge of a pine forest. 23 teenagers from Munich step out, their breath visible in the cold spring air. Most are looking at their phones. One girl is finishing a bag of chips. They're not expecting much, just another boring field trip their history teacher organized. Then they walk through the gate. Row after row after row of dark crosses stretch before them. Not white crosses like you see in American movies about war. These are black, made of basalt stone. Each one is exactly the same height, each one marking a grave. "How many are there?" whispers one student. Their teacher checks her notes. 39,108. The chips fall from the girl's hand. Nobody picks them up. This is the Lommel German War Cemetery, the largest collection of German war dead in Western Europe. And here's the thing that nobody tells you when you first arrive. These aren't the graves of Holocaust victims. These aren't the graves of civilians killed in bombing raids. These aren't concentration camp prisoners or resistance fighters or innocent children. These are the graves of German soldiers, Wehrmacht, some Waffen-SS, men who fought for Nazi Germany during World War II. And someone decided they deserved to be buried here, with dignity, with care, in a foreign country that Germany once invaded and occupied. Why? That's the mystery we're going to solve, somewhere in Belgium, 3 weeks after Germany surrendered, May 1945. Picture this. You're a Belgian farmer in 1945. For 5 years, German soldiers occupied your country. They took your food, they killed your neighbors, they shipped your Jewish friends to death camps. Maybe they even shot your brother for being in the resistance. Now those German soldiers are dead, and they're buried in your field, not in a nice cemetery, just there, in shallow graves marked with wooden crosses or helmets on sticks. Sometimes the graves are marked with nothing at all, just soft spots in the earth where bodies were dumped during the final chaotic months of the war. There are bodies everywhere, in farm fields, along roadsides, in forest clearings, by the hundreds, by the thousands. What do you do with them? This was the question facing Belgium and the Netherlands in 1945. It's a question nobody wanted to answer. It was too big, too complicated, too painful. The easy answer would have been, bulldoze them into mass graves and forget they ever existed. Many Allied soldiers who fought against the Germans, would have supported that solution. After everything the Nazis did, who cared about dignified burials for Wehrmacht soldiers? But here's where the story gets interesting. That's not what happened. Instead, Belgium and the Netherlands made a shocking decision. They would treat German war dead with the same care they gave to Allied soldiers. They would gather the scattered remains. They would create proper cemeteries. They would maintain the graves for their enemies. Why would they do that? What could possibly convince two countries that suffered so much under Nazi occupation to care for the graves of German soldiers? The answer involves discreet diplomatic negotiations, Cold War politics, ancient religious beliefs, humanitarian precedents from the First World War, and one organization that would transform from a Nazi-era burial service into something completely different, a force for peace. But first, we need to understand just how big this problem really was. Let's rewind to May 10th, 1940. At dawn, German forces launched Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands. Thousands of soldiers poured across the borders. German paratroopers dropped from the sky over Rotterdam, The Hague, and Key Dutch bridges at Moerdijk. In Belgium, airborne forces struck dramatically at Fort Eben and Mael. Tanks rolled through villages that had been peaceful the day before. Belgium fell in 18 days, the Netherlands in just 5. For the next 4 years, these countries lived under occupation. German soldiers were everywhere, in the cities, in the towns, in the countryside. They seemed invincible, like they would last forever. But they didn't. By September 1944, the Allies were pushing into Belgium. By early 1945, they were liberating the Netherlands. And as the German army retreated, it left something behind. Bodies. Lots of bodies. German soldiers died in the hundreds during the invasion. They died in the thousands during the occupation. From illness, from accidents, from partisan attacks. And they died in the tens of thousands during the desperate retreat at the end of the war. Every death created a grave, but these weren't organized military cemeteries. The German army was collapsing. There was no time for proper burials. Soldiers were buried where they fell, sometimes by their comrades, sometimes by enemy soldiers, sometimes by local civilians who were forced to do it at gunpoint. By May 1945, Belgium alone had approximately 684 scattered burial sites containing German remains. The Netherlands had more than 350. Nobody knew the exact count. Record-keeping had broken down. Some graves had markers, some didn't. Some had accurate information about who was buried there. Many were just listed as unknown German soldier. Add it all together, and you're looking at roughly 70,000 German graves spread across two small countries. Here's the question that haunted everyone. What do you do with 70,000 enemy graves? The Belgian government formed a special war graves service to figure it out. The Dutch government did the same. Both countries faced the same impossible choice. Option 1. Leave the graves scattered, but that meant 70,000 permanent reminders of the occupation dotting the landscape. It meant Belgian and Dutch farmers maintaining German graves on their land forever. It meant no closure. Option 2. Dig them up and send them back to Germany. But Germany was destroyed. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Germany didn't even have a functioning government. Who would receive the bodies? Where would they be buried? And who would pay for it? Option 3. Consolidate them into a few central cemeteries. This would clear the scattered graves from people's land. It would create organized sites that could be properly maintained. But it would require massive effort, finding every grave, exhuming every body, transporting remains, creating new cemeteries from scratch. And it would require answering the hardest question of all. Should enemy soldiers be buried with dignity? Here's something most people don't know. This wasn't the first time Europe had faced this question. After World War I, the Great War that ended in 1918, Germany had created an organization specifically to care for its war dead abroad. It was called the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge. In English, the German War Graves Commission. The Volksbund started with a simple idea. Every dead soldier, regardless of which side they fought on, deserves a proper burial. Your enemy in life should be your brother in death. It was a beautiful idea, and for 20 years, it worked. The Volksbund maintained German cemeteries across Europe. It was respected. It was even admired. Then came 1933. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took power in Germany. And like everything else in German society, the Volksbund was absorbed into the Nazi system. Nazi propaganda twisted the Volksbund's mission. Graves were no longer about peace. They were about glorifying sacrifice for the fatherland. Cemeteries became tools for nationalistic propaganda. The dead soldiers weren't mourned. They were celebrated as heroes who died so Germany could achieve greatness. When World War II ended in 1945, the Volksbund was dissolved. Allied Control Council Law No. 2 disbanded Nazi-affiliated organizations, and the Volksbund's activities ceased immediately. The Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, saw it as complicit with Hitler's regime. And they had good reason to think so. The Volksbund had cooperated with Nazi ideology. It had promoted nationalist militarism. But the organization wasn't formally banned forever. By 1946, within the British occupation zone, Allied authorities cautiously permitted limited reauthorization. By 1947, the Volksbund was formally reinstituted under strict Allied supervision, a reconstituted organization that would have to prove it had fundamentally changed. So when Belgium and the Netherlands started trying to figure out what to do with all those German graves in 1945, the Volksbund couldn't immediately help. It barely existed anymore. But those 70,000 graves weren't going anywhere. Someone had to deal with them. And slowly, reluctantly, a plan began to form. A plan that would require bringing the Volksbund back from near death and transforming it into something entirely new. Act 2. The Impossible Negotiation. Kassel, Germany. 1946. The city is in ruins. 90% of downtown Kassel was destroyed by British bombing in 1943. People live in cellars. They dig through rubble looking for anything useful. There's not enough food, not enough fuel, not enough hope. In a damaged building on the edge of town, a small group of men meet quietly. They're former members of the Volksbund. They want to restart the organization. But they have a problem. The Allied occupation authorities don't trust them. And why should they? These men worked under the Nazi regime. How can anyone be sure they won't just bring back Nazi ideology along with the grave maintenance? The Volksbund leaders know they need to prove something. They need to show that the organization has changed, that it's not about nationalism anymore, that it's about something deeper, about humanity, about dignity, about the universal right of the dead to be treated with respect. Slowly, carefully, they begin reaching out to Allied authorities. They write letters, they request meetings. They make a simple argument: Germany is broken. Germany can't even take care of its living citizens right now. But these dead soldiers are still Germany's responsibility. Let the Volksbund rebuild, not as a political organization, but as a humanitarian one. Most Allied officials ignore them. Some laugh, a few get angry. But then something changes. Multiple forces begin to align. By 1947, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies are no longer friends, they're enemies. The Iron Curtain divides Europe. Berlin is blockaded. There's talk of another war, this time between communism and democracy. Suddenly, West Germany looks different to Western leaders. It's no longer just a defeated enemy. It's a potential ally, a buffer against Soviet expansion, a place that needs to be rebuilt, strengthened, and integrated into Western Europe as quickly as possible. But Cold War politics alone didn't create the shift. Other forces were at work, forces that had been there all along. Christian religious leaders in Belgium and the Netherlands had never been comfortable with the idea of leaving enemy graves in disarray. Catholic doctrine, particularly, emphasized the sacred duty to bury the dead with dignity, regardless of who they were in life. Cardinal Joseph Ernest van Rooij in Belgium lobbied quietly for a humane solution. Dutch Protestant leaders echoed similar sentiments. There were also legal precedents. The 1929 Geneva Convention had established principles about treating war dead with respect, even enemy dead. These weren't just abstract ideals. They were part of international law that Belgium and the Netherlands took seriously. And there was something else: memory of the First World War. After 1918, Germany had maintained war cemeteries in Belgium and France without incident. It had been normal, expected, civilized. Both countries remembered that precedent. If they had allowed German graves then, what made this different? Everything made it different, of course. The Nazis weren't the Kaiser's army. The Holocaust wasn't the Western Front. But the precedent still mattered. It suggested that burying enemies with dignity was possible, that it had been done before. These forces, Cold War pragmatism, religious conviction, legal tradition, and historical precedent, converged in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Meanwhile, another crucial element fell into place: Allied oversight. Between 1946 and 1947, the initial reburials of scattered German remains were conducted under British Grave Service supervision. The Northwest Europe District of the British military administered the process according to Allied Control Council Directive Number 54, which mandated equal maintenance standards for all belligerents' graves within Allied occupation zones. This meant that from the very beginning, the consolidation of German graves wasn't a unilateral German project. It was supervised, regulated, and approved by the same Allied powers who had defeated Germany. That made all the difference. By 1952, everything falls into place. July 28, 1952. Brussels, Belgium. German and Belgian officials sit across from each other at a conference table. It's the first major treaty between Germany and Belgium since the war. Everyone in the room knows how strange this is. Just 7 years ago, these countries were mortal enemies. Now they're negotiating about graves. The treaty they sign is called the German-Belgian War Graves Agreement. It says that Germany, through the Volksbund, can create a central cemetery for all German war dead in Belgium. The German government will pay for it. The Volksbund will build it and maintain it. Belgium will provide the land. But there are strict conditions. No Nazi symbols, no swastikas, no eagles, no propaganda, no political ceremonies, no nationalist rallies, No military parades, no glorification. The cemetery must be somber, humble, a place for mourning, not celebrating. And crucially, no Belgian state funds would support the cemetery beyond providing the land. This compromise was necessary to appease Belgian resistance associations, groups like the Fédération Nationale des Anciens Résistants de Belgique, who had initially opposed the entire project. They didn't want a single Belgian franc going toward honoring German soldiers. The location they choose is Lommel, a small town near the Belgian-Dutch border. It's remote enough that it won't offend people who don't want to see a German cemetery, but it's accessible enough for families who want to visit. 4 months later, the Netherlands signs an almost identical agreement. They choose a location near the village of Venray, close to a place called Ysselsteyn. Like Belgium, the Dutch government faced opposition from veterans groups, particularly the Nederlandse Federatie van Verzetsdeelnemers. The compromise was similar. Land provided, but the work and funding would come from Germany. The Dutch War Graves Foundation, Oorlogsgravenstichting, would maintain humanitarian oversight. Both countries are making the same bet, that honoring the dead, even enemy dead, is the first step toward lasting peace. But signing agreements is the easy part. Now comes the hard part. Moving 70,000 bodies. Lommel, Belgium. Spring 1953. The construction begins. Volksbund workers arrive with blueprints, shovels, and determination. They have a massive job ahead of them. Create a cemetery that can hold nearly 40,000 graves. The land they've been given is mostly forest. They clear trees. They level ground. They dig drainage ditches. They plan roads and pathways. They design entry buildings and maintenance facilities. But the real work is happening elsewhere, in 684 different locations across Belgium. Teams of specialists fan out across the country. They carry old military records, death registries, and crude maps showing where bodies might be buried. Sometimes local people guide them. There's a German buried in that field, 3 more by the old church. I think there's one in the woods, but I can't remember exactly where. When they find a grave, they exhume it carefully. They document everything. They look for identification tags, personal effects, anything that might tell them who this person was. They place the remains in a casket. They transport it to Lommel. It takes years of digging up bodies from farm fields and roadsides and forest clearings. Years of Belgian citizens watching German workers remove the last physical traces of the occupation from their land. Years of grief, both old and new. Not everyone is happy about it. Some Belgians think German soldiers deserve to be forgotten, not remembered. Resistance fighters who lost comrades feel betrayed. Some write angry letters to newspapers. Some protest outside the construction site. But the work continues. The Belgian government holds firm to its commitment. The treaty has been signed. The decision has been made. At the same time, the same process is happening in the Netherlands. Ysselsteyn is rising from the ground. More than 31,000 graves will eventually be consolidated there. The architect for both projects is a man named Robert Tischler. He's the Volksbund's chief designer. And he faces a unique challenge. How do you design a cemetery that shows respect without glorification? That acknowledges death without celebrating it? That serves as a memorial without becoming a monument to the Nazi regime? His solution is radical. Make everything the same. Walk through Lommel or Ysselsteyn today, and you'll see Tischler's vision. Every grave marker is identical. Dark basalt crosses, low to the ground, no tall monuments, no elaborate headstones, no hierarchy. A general lies next to a private. An officer lies next to a teenage conscript. In death, they're all equal. The crosses are arranged in perfect rows, but the rows aren't intimidating. They're somber, peaceful. The landscaping is simple. Grass, trees, low bushes. Nothing flashy. There are no statues of soldiers in heroic poses. No eternal flames. No grand gates. Just simple stone structures that seem to say, these were men. They died. They're buried here. Tischler's design drew on practical constraints as much as philosophy. Post-war Germany faced severe material shortages. Using uniform basalt crosses was cost-effective. The egalitarian approach also built on precedents from World War I cemeteries. Tischler was reusing design specifications from the 1920s that emphasized equality among the fallen. But, whatever the original practical motivations, the effect was profound. These cemeteries conveyed humility and restraint, qualities that later generations would interpret as acknowledgement of guilt, though the original design language spoke primarily to mourning and equality rather than explicit contrition. Compare this to Allied cemeteries, like the famous American cemetery in Normandy, France. There, white crosses stretch toward the sky in gleaming rows. There's a sense of honor, of sacrifice, of victory. The architecture says, these men gave their lives for freedom. The German cemeteries say something different. These men died in a terrible war. Let's not forget. But let's not celebrate either. This design wasn't just aesthetic. It was political. It was moral. It was Germany's way of threading an impossible needle, caring for the dead without glorifying what they fought for. The work took years, longer than anyone expected. Lommel's construction ran from 1953 through 1959. Ysselsteyn's consolidation was completed by 1957, though both cemeteries were formally dedicated in 1959. On September 6, 1959, Lommel was officially inaugurated in a somber ceremony attended by Belgian, German, and Allied officials. The question now was, what would people do with them? Act 3, From Shame to Reconciliation. Lommel, summer 1959. An elderly woman steps off a bus. She's German. She carries a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in newspaper. She walks slowly, using a cane. Her eyes scan the rows of crosses, looking for one specific name. She finds it. Her son. Killed in October 1944. He was 19 years old. For 14 years, she didn't know where he was buried. She'd heard he died, somewhere in Belgium, but no one could tell her where. She sent letters to the Red Cross, to the German government, to anyone who might know. No one had answers. Now, finally, she knows. She places the flowers by the cross, she cries, she stays for 2 hours. She's not alone. In those first years after Lommel and Ysselsteyn opened, thousands of German families made pilgrimages to Belgium and the Netherlands. Mothers looking for sons, wives looking for husbands, brothers looking for brothers. It was painful. It was necessary. It was the first step toward closure. But something else was happening too. Something unexpected. Ysselsteyn, 1966. A group of German teenagers arrives at the cemetery. But they're not visiting family graves. They're here to work. They're part of a new program organized by the Volksbund. Instead of just maintaining graves through paid workers, the Volksbund has started inviting youth groups to help with upkeep. Students come for a week or two. They clear weeds. They clean crosses. They repair pathways. But more importantly, they learn. In the evenings, they sit in circles and talk about the war. They read letters written by soldiers buried in the cemetery. They discuss what happened, why it happened, how to prevent it from happening again. And here's what makes it really powerful. They're not just German students. The Volksbund invites Belgian and Dutch students too. Former enemies work together, talk together, learn together. A German teenager might clear weeds from a grave in the morning, then eat lunch with a Dutch teenager whose grandfather was shot by German soldiers. They talk about it, really talk about it, not to assign blame, but to understand. This wasn't in the original plan. When Belgium and the Netherlands agreed to let Germany create these cemeteries in 1952, they were thinking about politics and logistics. They weren't thinking about turning them into peace education centers. But that's what they became, gradually. The transformation wasn't immediate. Through the 1950s, the Volksbund operated under Allied supervision, focused primarily on grave maintenance. The explicit peace education mission formalized only after 1962, when the Lommel Youth Meeting Center opened its doors. By the 1970s, thousands of young people were participating in these programs every year. Lommel and Ysselsteyn weren't just cemeteries anymore. They were classrooms. They were bridges between nations. The crosses in the ground were teaching lessons that textbooks couldn't. Ysselsteyn, 1984. But then the questions started. A Dutch journalist publishes an article. He's been researching the names on the crosses at Ysselsteyn, and he's discovered something troubling. Many of the men buried there weren't just regular Wehrmacht soldiers. They were Waffen-SS. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, was Hitler's elite military force. They weren't just soldiers. They ran concentration camps. They carried out mass executions. They were directly responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the Holocaust. And now, the journalist points out, they're buried in a Dutch cemetery, with the same crosses as everyone else, treated with the same dignity. Is that right? The question explodes into public debate. Some people say, no, absolutely not. War criminals don't deserve dignified burials. There should be a separate section for SS members, or they shouldn't be there at all. Others say, but where do you draw the line? How do you determine who was a good German soldier and who was a bad one? Many Wehrmacht soldiers participated in atrocities too, and many SS members were conscripted against their will. The Volksbund's official position is clear. We don't judge. The dead are dead. They're all humans. They all get equal treatment. But is that moral, or is it a form of denial? The debate never fully resolves. It continues to this day. Every few years, someone writes an article or gives a speech raising the same concerns. And in 1985, something happens that brings these questions to the entire world's attention. Bitburg, Germany. May 1985. U.S. President Ronald Reagan is visiting West Germany. As part of his trip, he agrees to lay a wreath at a German military cemetery in Bitburg. It's supposed to be a gesture of reconciliation. America honoring German war. Dead is a symbol of how far both countries have come since World War II. Then someone checks the Bitburg cemetery records. 49 of the soldiers buried there were Waffen-SS. The news explodes. Holocaust survivors are outraged. Jewish organizations demand Reagan cancel the visit. Protests erupt. Even Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner, personally asks Reagan not to go. Reagan faces an impossible choice. If he cancels, he insults Germany and looks like he's backing down from pressure. If he goes through with it, he looks like he's honoring Nazis. He decides to go, but he adds a stop to a concentration camp first to make clear he's not celebrating the SS. The visit is awkward and controversial, and it raises the same questions that were being asked about Lommel and Ysselsteyn. Is there a difference between remembering the dead and honoring them? Can you mourn a person without endorsing what they did? Where's the line between reconciliation and moral compromise? These aren't easy questions. They don't have easy answers. But one thing becomes clear. German war cemeteries aren't just about the past. They're about how we deal with the past in the present. Act 4. Memory in the Modern Age. Berlin. November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall falls. Within a year, East and West Germany reunify. The Cold War ends, Europe transforms, and suddenly German war cemeteries take on new meaning. For 40 years, West Germany tried to prove it was different from Nazi Germany. The cemeteries at Lommel and Ysselsteyn were part of that proof. Look, we handle our history with humility and responsibility. Now, with reunification, Germany must integrate millions of people who grew up under communist rule, people who were taught a different version of history, people who weren't part of the West German process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. The Volksbund expands its educational programs. More student groups visit. More international workshops happen. The cemeteries become, even more explicitly, tools for teaching democracy and human rights. But they also face new threats. Ysselsteyn, September 2018. A small group of men in black clothing gathers at the cemetery. They place flags and flowers at specific graves, all Waffen-SS members. They take photos. They post them online. They're neo-Nazis. And they've decided that Ysselsteyn is a pilgrimage site, a place to honor their fallen heroes. The Dutch government is horrified. Local residents are outraged. The Volksbund issues statements condemning the visits. But what can they do? The cemetery is technically public. People can visit. These incidents, like the Erinnerung Marsch in 2018 and 2019, represent marginal movements. Fewer than 100 participants attend these commemorations. But the symbolism stings. Dutch police monitor the events closely. Local authorities quickly implement restrictions on political demonstrations at the site. Civic organizations organize counter-events, emphasizing peace and reconciliation. This is the dark side of preservation. By maintaining these graves, by treating them with dignity, you create spaces that extremists can attempt to misuse. They try to twist reconciliation into glorification. They want to turn memorials into propaganda. It's the same old problem from 1945, just in a new form. How do you honor the dead without celebrating what they did? The Volksbund's response is to double down on education. They install new information panels explaining the context of the burials. They partner with anti-extremism organizations. They train guides to handle difficult questions. But they don't remove the graves. They don't change the equal treatment. They hold to the principle. Even if we disagree with how someone lived, we don't desecrate where they're buried. It's a difficult position. Not everyone agrees with it. But it's the position they maintain, while simultaneously working to ensure that the cemeteries remain spaces for reflection and peace education, not platforms for hate. Kassel, Germany, 2018. The Volksbund launches a new initiative, digitizing all records of German war graves. The pilot program began in 2017, and by 2018, the full online database, Gräbersuche, goes live with more than 4.8 million entries. Every name, every date, every location, all searchable online. Within months, they receive thousands of messages, people from around the world searching for family members, historians researching specific units, students working on projects. A woman in Australia discovers her grandfather's grave at Lommel. She thought he died in Russia. For 70 years, her family had the wrong information. A German teenager finds his great-great-uncle at Ysselsteyn. He reads the online records. He sees that his ancestor was only 17 when he died, the same age he is now. The digital archive makes the cemeteries real for people who will never visit them in person. The names on the crosses aren't just statistics anymore. They're individual people, each with a story, each with family who might still be looking for them. But digitization also brings new challenges. How do you contextualize information online? How do you prevent extremists from using the databases to create martyrology lists? How do you balance transparency with respect? These are new problems, but they are versions of the same old problem that's existed since 1945. Lommel, April 15th, 2024. Remember those Munich students from the beginning? They've been at the cemetery for 3 hours now. The fog has lifted. The sun is out. They're sitting in small groups, scattered among the crosses. Each group has been assigned a specific grave to research. They're looking up names on their phones, reading about the battles where these soldiers died, finding biographical details when they exist. One girl, the one who dropped her chips, is crying. She's found a 17-year-old buried here. His name was Heinrich. He died 3 days before the war ended. 3 days. It's so pointless, she says. He was just a kid. Her teacher nods. That's what war is. Pointless death. Which is why places like this exist, not to glorify these soldiers, not even to honor them, really, but to remember, to make sure we understand what war actually costs. Another student asks, but what about the ones who were Nazis? Like, really Nazis? The ones who committed atrocities? The teacher doesn't have a simple answer. That's complicated. That's what you're supposed to think about. How do we remember difficult history? How do we acknowledge that people can be both perpetrators and victims? How do we mourn individual deaths while also condemning the system they fought for? The students don't have simple answers either. That's the point. At 3 p.m., they board the bus. But they're different than when they arrived. Quieter, more thoughtful. Some are still crying. Others are talking in low voices about what they saw. They'll return to Munich tomorrow, but Lommel will stay with them. It always does. Act 5. The Verdict of History. Here's what makes Lommel and Ysselsteyn so fascinating. They're monuments to a paradox. Germany invaded Belgium and the Netherlands. Germany occupied them. Germany caused tremendous suffering. And yet Belgium and the Netherlands chose to care for German graves with dignity. Why? Not for one reason, but for many reasons that converged. There was Cold War politics. By the early 1950s, West Germany was becoming a crucial Western ally against Soviet expansion. Treating German war dead with dignity became part of integrating Germany into the Western alliance. There were Christian beliefs about burying the dead. Catholic leaders like Cardinal van Rooij in Belgium and Protestant clergy in the Netherlands insisted that sacred duty transcended political hatred. Every human being, regardless of what they'd done in life, deserved burial with dignity. There were legal precedents. The 1929 Geneva Convention established principles about treating war dead with respect. Allied Control Council directives mandated equal maintenance standards for all belligerents' graves. There was historical memory. After World War I, Germany had maintained cemeteries in Belgium and France without incident. That precedent suggested reconciliation was possible, and there was practical necessity. Leaving 70,000 scattered graves meant keeping the wound of occupation open forever. Consolidating them allowed for closure, not forgetting, but moving forward. But there's something deeper too. By choosing dignity over vengeance, Belgium and the Netherlands made a statement about values. They said, "We're better than that. We're not going to desecrate graves, even enemy graves. We're not going to stoop to the level of the regime that occupied us." It's a powerful statement, but it comes at a cost. The cost is complexity. The cost is discomfort. The cost is living with questions that don't have easy answers. Should all war dead be treated equally? Does burying someone with dignity mean you're honoring them? Is reconciliation possible without justice? Lommel and Ysselsteyn force us to grapple with these questions. They don't give us answers. They give us space to think. Let's zoom out and look at the big picture. Lommel, 39,108 graves. Ysselsteyn, 31,598 graves. Total, 70,706 German soldiers buried in just 2 cemeteries. For comparison, the American cemetery at Normandy holds 9,387 graves. The Tyne-Cot Commonwealth Cemetery in Belgium, the largest Commonwealth war cemetery in the world, holds 11,956 graves. Lommel alone holds more than 3 times as many graves as Normandy. Why? Because Germany lost. Badly. The Allies could repatriate most of their dead or bury them in organized cemeteries established during the war. Germany couldn't. Germany was destroyed. Germany was occupied. Germany's dead were scattered across a continent. The scale of consolidation required to create Lommel and Ysselsteyn was massive. More than 684 separate burial sites in Belgium alone. More than 350 in the Netherlands. Thousands of exhumations. Years of work. And it wasn't just logistics. Each exhumation meant someone had to dig up human remains. Someone had to document them. Someone had to transport them. Someone had to rebury them. Think about that for a moment. Think about the emotional toll on the people doing that work. Belgian and Dutch citizens exhuming the bodies of soldiers who occupied their countries. German workers handling the remains of men who might have been their relatives, their neighbors, their classmates. It's one of the most extraordinary acts of reconciliation in modern history, and most people have never heard of it. Here's something interesting. Visit an Allied cemetery and a German cemetery on the same day, and you'll see 2 completely different philosophies of memory. Allied cemeteries are designed to inspire tall white crosses or stars of David, manicured lawns, grand memorials with inscriptions about sacrifice and freedom. They say, "These men died for something noble. Remember their courage." German cemeteries are designed to humble, low, dark crosses, simple landscaping, minimal text. They say, "These men died in a terrible war. Remember what war costs. Don't repeat our mistakes." It's the difference between memorial and warning, between honor and caution, between victory and defeat. Both approaches are valid. Both serve a purpose. But the German approach does something unique. It forces Germans to confront their history without the comfort of righteousness. There's no "we died for freedom" narrative available to them. Just, "we died in a war our country started, and millions of innocents died because of it." That's a heavy burden, but it's an honest one. And strangely, that honesty has made German war cemeteries more powerful as peace education tools than many Allied cemeteries. Because they don't let you hide behind glory. They make you face the reality of violence, death, and moral failure. Remember, the Volksbund started as an organization tainted by cooperation with the Nazi regime. In 1945, Allied Control Council Law No. 2 dissolved it along with other Nazi-affiliated organizations. Many people thought it should stay disbanded forever, but today, the Volksbund is one of Europe's leading peace education organizations. How did that transformation happen? It wasn't fast, it wasn't easy, and it required the organization to completely reimagine its mission. In the late 1940s, under Allied supervision, the Volksbund was just trying to survive, to prove it could maintain graves without promoting nationalism. In the 1960s and 70s, after the formal establishment of peace education programs in 1962, it began the youth program, bringing together young people from former enemy nations. In the 1980s and 90s, it explicitly embraced its role as an educator about democracy, human rights, and the dangers of extremism. Today, the Volksbund runs programs in over 45 countries. It maintains nearly 2.8 million German war graves worldwide. But more importantly, it hosts thousands of young people every year in workshops, exchanges, and peace education seminars. The organization's motto, formalized in 1954 and reaffirmed through the 1990s, became Versöhnung über den Gräbern, Arbeit für den Frieden. In English, reconciliation over the graves, work for peace. That's not just a slogan change. That's a fundamental transformation of purpose. The Volksbund essentially turned itself inside out, from an organization that saw graves as endpoints to one that sees them as starting points for learning. It's one of the most successful organizational rehabilitations in modern history, and most people outside Germany don't know it exists. Epilogue. Fields of stone, fields of questions. Ysselsteyn, Netherlands. Late afternoon. The sun is setting. The cemetery is almost empty. An elderly man walks slowly between the crosses. He's German, but he lives in the Netherlands now, has for 50 years. He stops at one particular grave, not a family member, just someone whose story he learned years ago. A 19-year-old conscript from Hamburg who died in December 1944. The young man wrote letters home saying he didn't want to fight, didn't believe in the cause, just wanted to survive and go home. He never made it. The old man places a small stone on the cross, a Jewish tradition he's adopted. He does this every few months. Nobody asked him to. Nobody knows he does it. "I'm sorry," he whispers, to the dead boy, to the world, to history. Then he walks away, disappearing into the rows of identical crosses as the light fades. So here's the answer to the question we started with. Why would Belgium and the Netherlands choose to care for German war graves? Not because they forgot what happened, not because they forgave easily, not because they thought German soldiers were innocent. They did it because they understood something profound. How you treat your enemies dead says more about you than about them. They did it because leaving 70,000 scattered graves would have kept the wound open forever. Consolidating them allowed for closure, not forgetting, but moving forward. They did it because multiple forces converged. Cold War pragmatism made West Germany an ally. Christian tradition insisted on dignified burial for all. International law established precedents for respecting enemy dead. And historical memory from World War I showed that such reconciliation was possible. They did it because powerful voices within their own societies, religious leaders, humanitarian organizations, legal scholars, argued that desecrating graves would make them no better than the regime they had defeated. But most of all, they did it because they bet that graves could be more than graves, that they could be classrooms, that they could teach lessons about war, peace, guilt, responsibility, and the difficult work of reconciliation. Were they right? Walk through Lommel or Ysselsteyn today, and you'll find your answer. You'll see school groups from 5 different countries. You'll see teenagers cleaning crosses and asking hard questions. You'll see German grandchildren seeking the graves of grandfathers they never met. You'll see Dutch and Belgian citizens tending a cemetery for their former occupiers, not out of obligation anymore, but out of choice. You'll see 70,000 reasons why war is terrible, but you'll also see one reason why peace is possible. But let's be honest, not everything is resolved. Not everything is reconciled. The question about SS graves remains. Every few years, someone writes an article or gives a speech arguing that war criminals don't deserve equal treatment. And they have a point. Is there a moral difference between a teenage conscript who never fired his weapon and an SS officer who participated in massacres? Of course there is. But how do you reflect that difference in a cemetery without creating hierarchy? Without implying that some deaths matter more than others? Without making judgments that may not stand up to historical scrutiny? The Volksbund's answer, treat everyone equally, feels unsatisfying, but every alternative feels worse. The question about extremist misuse remains. How do you prevent neo-Nazis from attempting to turn memorial sites into pilgrimage destinations? The Volksbund tries through education, through careful messaging, through partnerships with anti-extremism groups. Dutch and Belgian authorities respond swiftly with legal restrictions and civic counter-programming when incidents occur. But they can't control who visits. They can't control what those visitors think. Is it worth maintaining these cemeteries if small groups of extremists can attempt to misuse them? Or is the educational value for thousands of ordinary students more important than preventing misuse by a marginal few? There's no clear answer. The question about memory itself remains. What are we actually remembering at these cemeteries? The individual human beings buried there? The system they fought for? The suffering they caused? The suffering they experienced? All of the above? None of the above? Memory is complicated. It's never just one thing. But here's what Lommel and Ysselsteyn teach us, even without resolving every question. First lesson, reconciliation is messy. It's uncomfortable. It requires sitting with contradictions. If you're looking for neat answers about good guys and bad guys, you won't find them here. Second lesson, the choice to treat enemy dead with dignity isn't about the dead. They're beyond help or harm. It's about the living. It's about what kind of society you want to be. Third lesson, physical spaces matter. You can read about the horrors of war in a textbook and forget it by tomorrow. But stand among 39,000 graves and it becomes real in a way that words never can. Fourth lesson, peace isn't the absence of conflict. Peace is the hard work of choosing understanding over hatred, even when hatred would be easier, especially when hatred would be easier. Fifth lesson, some questions shouldn't be answered. Should all war dead be treated equally? Maybe the point is to keep asking the question, to keep wrestling with it, to never get comfortable with easy answers. The story of Lommel and Ysselsteyn isn't over. Every year, new visitors arrive. New students participate in the youth programs. New debates emerge about how to present difficult history. In 2017, the Volksbund launched a pilot program for digital archives. By 2018, the full online database, Gräbersuche, went live with more than 4.8 million entries. In 2023, they launched a new initiative, virtual reality tours of the cemeteries for schools that can't afford to visit in person. Students in Japan, in Brazil, in South Africa can now walk through Lommel and see the scale of the graves. They can click on individual crosses and read the stories behind them. Is digital memory the same as physical memory? Can you learn the same lessons through a VR headset that you learn by actually standing there? Nobody knows yet, but the Volksbund is trying. Because the mission now isn't just about maintaining graves. It's about keeping the lessons of those graves alive for generations who will never meet a World War II survivor, for whom the war is ancient history, as distant as the Napoleonic Wars or the Roman Empire. How do you make distant history feel urgent? How do you make 70,000 deaths in a war that ended 80 years ago matter to a teenager in 2024 who's worried about climate change and social media and getting into university? That's the challenge facing Lommel and Ysselsteyn today. And somehow, against the odds, it seems to be working. Remember those Munich students from the beginning of our story? 3 months after their visit to Lommel, their teacher receives emails from several of them. They want to come back. They want to volunteer for the summer youth program. They want to learn more. One student writes, "I can't stop thinking about Heinrich, the 17-year-old who died 3 days before the end. I keep wondering what he was thinking in those last days. Did he know the war was almost over? Did he want to just hide and survive? How did his parents feel when they found out he died so close to the end? I need to understand this better." That's the power of these places. They turn statistics into individuals. They turn history into something personal. Here's the strangest thing about Lommel and Ysselsteyn. They're German cemeteries on foreign soil, maintained by a German organization, funded by German money. But they exist only because Belgium and the Netherlands allowed them to. Germany needed permission to bury its own dead. Think about how extraordinary that is. After World War I, Germany maintained military cemeteries in France and Belgium as a matter of course. It was expected. Victors and vanquished both buried their dead where they fell. But after World War II, that assumption was gone. Germany's crimes were too great. Germany's defeat was too complete. Germany couldn't assume anything. So Germany had to ask, humbly, carefully, with full acknowledgement of what had happened. And Belgium and the Netherlands could have said no. They had every right to say no. Many of their citizens wanted them to say no. But they said yes, not because Germany deserved it, because they, Belgium and the Netherlands, chose to be the kind of countries that would say yes even to their enemies. That choice defines them as much as it defines the graves. Lommel, dusk. When the last visitor leaves and the gates close for the night, what remains? 39,108 dark crosses in perfect rows. Silent. Unchanging. They don't judge. They don't justify. They don't explain. They just stand there, marking where bodies lie. But here's what they represent. They represent the choice to see enemies as human beings, even after everything. They represent the recognition that guilt and grief can coexist, that you can acknowledge atrocities while still mourning individual deaths. They represent the hope that future generations will learn from past failures. They represent the uncomfortable truth that peace requires more courage than war, because war lets you hate simply, but peace forces you to understand complexity. They represent 70 years of Belgian and Dutch citizens choosing every single day to maintain graves for people who invaded their countries. That's not forgetting. That's not even forgiving. That's something harder and more mature. It's accepting that you can remember terrible things while still moving forward. And they represent thousands of young people who've walked among these stones and asked themselves, could I have been one of them? Could I have been swept up in nationalism and propaganda? Could I have ended up in uniform, fighting for a cause I didn't believe in, dying for a regime I didn't choose? The honest answer is maybe, probably, yes. That's the scariest lesson of Lommel and Ysselsteyn. Not that some people are monsters, but that ordinary people, under the right or wrong circumstances, can participate in monstrous systems. And the hopeful lesson is, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose differently. We can resist differently. We can remember differently. The stones don't speak, but they teach. And as long as students keep visiting, keep questioning, keep struggling with the complexity, then Lommel and Ysselsteyn are fulfilling their purpose. They're not monuments to the dead. They're warnings to the living. They don't say, remember the fallen heroes. They say, remember what happens when good people stop asking difficult questions. They say, remember that nationalism can turn deadly in a single generation. They say, remember that war doesn't discriminate. It kills teenagers and generals, believers and doubters, volunteers and conscripts, all the same. And most importantly, they say, remember that the hardest choice is often the right one, and that choosing dignity for your enemies might be the only thing that stops the cycle of revenge. On a rainy afternoon in November 2023, a small ceremony takes place at Lommel. It's the anniversary of the cemetery's dedication. Officials from Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands attend. So, do about 60 students from a dozen schools. The Belgian mayor speaks, the German ambassador speaks. A Dutch survivor of the occupation, now 97 years old, speaks. But the most memorable speech comes from a 16-year-old German student named Emma. She's been volunteering at Lommel for 2 summers. She says, I used to think history was about memorizing dates and names. Then I came here and realized history is about choices. The choice to invade or to resist. The choice to fight or to flee. The choice to remember or to forget. The choice to hate or to understand. My great-grandfather is buried here. Row 19, cross 432. I never knew him. He died before my grandmother was born. I don't know if he was a good person or a bad person. I don't know if he believed in Nazism or if he was just scared and following orders. What I know is that he was 22 years old when he died, same age as my brother, and someone in Belgium decided he deserved a grave. Someone decided that even though he was the enemy, he was still human. That's the choice I want to remember. Not because it excuses anything, but because it shows that we can break cycles. We can choose to be better. These stones don't forgive the past. They just remind us that we have a choice about the future. The rain continues to fall. The crosses stand silent as they have for more than 6 decades, as they will for generations to come. 39,000 stories that will never be fully told. 39,000 reminders of what happens when nations forget how to talk to each other. 39,000 reasons to keep asking the difficult questions. Fields of stone, fields of silence, fields of lessons that refuse to stay buried. This is Lommel. This is Ysselsteyn. This is where Europe learned that you can't build peace on hatred, only on the hard work of remembering, honestly and completely, what hatred costs. The crosses don't wave flags. They don't sing anthems. They don't celebrate anything. They just stand there, dark and humble and permanent, teaching the only lesson that matters. War has no winners, only graves. And if we're lucky, if we're brave enough to sit with discomfort and ask hard questions and refuse easy answers, those graves might just teach us how to stop filling cemeteries with young people who should have lived long, ordinary, beautiful lives. That's the legacy of Lommel and Ysselsteyn. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not closure, just the stubborn, difficult, absolutely necessary work of learning from the dead so the living can do better.